But the evidence in the record now is becoming clearer and clearer.
No longer assume the temperature of the world is stable.
Более 70 лет, но все еще загрязненность воздуха остается.
Average American, that carbon footprint is about 16 tons of carbon emissions.
What about COP26? What is COP?
The potential threats to the surrounding natural environment breaking frequency of the ocean. The UN is calling the world's first climate change fountain.
That new snippet you just heard was a clip from the United Nations that was played at the Climate Change Conference in the UK last year. The audio you hear is the result of the global devastation from different catastrophic climate events from around the world that were all a result of climate change. But hi, my name is Christina and this is The Inclusive Inquiry. I'm on a journey to becoming a more inclusive designer, and climate change has always been a topic of interest for me. I'm really interested to discover the role I can play in creating sustainable designs. I'm joined here by two of my peers, Angie and Flavia, who have similar interests in this area. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hello, I am Angie, and this is my first time on the podcast. I'm a bit nervous, but I am really happy to be here with Christina and Flavia to talk about climate change and sustainability. Sustainable design is also something that I focused on in my career because it's a necessary change for the future. I also hope to research about the possibility of being more inclusive while developing sustainability.
Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great day. I am Flavia and I'm also excited about today's episode. I've been interested in this topic for some time and I am so glad to be able to share this space with you guys. Cannot wait for us to start our discussion and exchange of ideas.
Awesome, thank you both for joining me in this discussion. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing climate change, sustainable development, and more specifically, how this ties to inclusive design. We're collectively looking at ways we can be more inclusive designers by questioning the current way of doing things and how we can look at it from a more inclusive approach. Flavia, do you think you could describe our current climate crisis to give our listeners some background on this issue?
Yes, of course. Essentially, our global temperature has risen to a point of extreme concern. Greenhouse gas emissions have reached new highs and are only expected to keep increasing. We are seeing glaciers melting, rising sea levels, drought, excess precipitations, and extreme weather events. It's becoming increasingly important that we seek solutions before this change become completely reversible. And I believe one way we can ideate solutions is through sustainable development.
Wow, yeah, I definitely agree that this is something that requires our immediate attention. But what is sustainable development, and how might this be the key to feasible solutions?
I can jump in here. There is a quote from the International Institute for Sustainable Development that describes it well. I will share it here. They describe sustainable development as development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The United Nations has laid out sustainable development goals to serve as a blueprint for achieving a more sustainable future.
Yes, that's right, Angie. And also, the Sustainable Development Goal number 13 addresses climate action. We've seen some examples of sustainable development through designs, such as the electric car, which aims to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are a result of transportation. In fact, some companies making headway in this department are Volvo, who has promised to only sell electric vehicles by 2030, or also General Motors, who is aiming for a zero carbon portfolio by 2035.
That's really interesting. It's refreshing to see that these bigger companies are attempting to make an impact. But I think another important point is that often when we think about climate change, we tend to think it's just an issue that affects the entire global population, which it does, but it disproportionately affects vulnerable groups, and I think that's something that isn't talked about enough.
Exactly. Could you elaborate on that? Who are the people that make up these vulnerable groups and how are they affected?
Yeah, well, there are roughly 3.5 billion people who live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change, as it disproportionately affects low income countries and people with low incomes in higher income countries. These groups not only include poor populations, but members of minority groups, women, children, older people, people with chronic diseases and disabilities, those residing in areas with high prevalence of climate related diseases, and workers who are exposed to extreme heat or increased weather variability. These groups are more susceptible to adverse health effects such as heat related disorders, vector borne, foodborne, and waterborne diseases, respiratory and allergic disorders, malnutrition, collective violence, and mental health problems that are all a result of climate change.
Wow. Could you draw the connection between how these vulnerable groups are facing greater inequity?
Yeah, of course. For starters, these lower income countries produce the least greenhouse gas emissions, but are more affected by climate change than high income countries, which produce significantly higher amounts but are less immediately affected. These low income countries also have much less capability and resources to adapt to climate change than higher income countries. These poorer countries are suffering a greater adverse effect because they are more exposed to very high temperatures, and their economies rely heavily on agriculture, natural resources, and other sectors that are exposed to extreme weather variability. And approaches such as air conditioning, insurance, and other risk management solutions are much less available to them.
Hearing about this inequity helps put into perspective how some of the global attempts at sustainable development to combat climate change have equity issues as well, right?
Yes, I agree. While current attempts at solutions such as electric cars, carbon tax, and bikeable neighborhoods are all good ideas in theory, I can see where this greater inequality lies.
Yeah, exactly. These poor countries and populations are the ones facing the greatest effects of climate change, yet these solutions are not designed with those populations in mind. In the case of bikeable neighborhoods and electric cars, car ownership is actually a lot lower among low income populations, and it's likely that people with higher incomes are less likely to be regular bicyclists. But these wealthier neighborhoods are the ones who have the budget to introduce bike lanes and modified sidewalks. These solutions are not aimed at the rich, the ones who are contributing the most to this issue.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. It's great that we are attempting to tackle such a complex problem, but maybe we are going about it the wrong way. Let's circle back to the issue of climate change as a whole and why it has been so difficult for us to combat our growing greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to these negative environmental and health effects.
I think one instance where the issue lies is that we have two outputs that can be generalized at the cost of climate change. The first being how we respond to the current environmental disasters such as droughts, flooding, and heat waves that are already occurring as a result of climate change. The second is looking to the future and how we can put policies and other solutions into places to reduce emissions, which could come in the form of higher fossil fuel costs today. I think where the current struggle lies is attempting to deal with both of these costs at the same time. How do we go about navigating where to put resources into developing solutions to create a better future when we are already facing extreme costs today?
Yeah, this is definitely a question that raises a much larger issue, especially now that we've developed a deep dependence on fossil fuels that have been driving up Earth's temperature for over a century.
Yeah, and we've made steps towards this with wind and solar power, but there is still a lot to be done. Governments and policymakers have tools to bring about change and delegate that responsibility, but as we've discussed, it is so important that human rights are considered in developing and implementing mitigation and adaptation measures.
I think governments and policymakers have a huge role to play, but they won't necessarily do it on their own. What are some ways we can advocate for the kinds of solutions we actually need?
Well, non governmental and humanitarian organizations need to hold governments accountable in protecting and promoting these human rights, and we can support them in that. We can advocate for energy policies that promote use of renewable energy, decrease use of fossil fuels, and reduce energy demand. And transportation policies that promote walking, bicycling, and the use of fuel efficient vehicles, even agriculture policies to help to decrease meat production and consumption, appropriate development of biofuels, and aim to reduce methane emissions. Also, implementing land use policies that promote the expansion of forests which can act as carbon dioxide sinks, which aim to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere.
Oh, yeah, those are really great points, Flavia. Another thing to consider is our role as inclusive designers. How can we contribute to being part of the solution? Do we have a role to play in addressing sustainable development ideas that aim to combat climate change?
I think that as inclusive designers, we have a big role to play. As Christina mentioned earlier, a common theme in current attempts at sustainable development is equity. There are vulnerable groups who are disproportionately affected, and we should look at how we can connect with those groups and give them a voice.
Yeah, I agree. Looking at the groups being affected and communicating with them to address their needs and developing solutions with them, rather than assuming a sustainable development solution will benefit them. Because as we've discussed, even though some solutions are often well intended, they don't address this common theme of inequity that arises from them.
That's right. Sustainable development has the potential to result in powerful, innovative designs that help to address the problems that these vulnerable groups are facing, and taking an inclusive design approach can possibly be the thing we need to break down these barriers that we are currently facing in sustainable design.
Well, one thing I wanted to add was that the UN's Climate Change Conference, or COP27, recently took place, and they did make some steps towards identifying the inequity that is a result of climate change.
Really? What were the main takeaways of this conference?
I read about this too. One thing I thought was interesting is that they developed a funding arrangement to help support these lower income countries that are more prone to facing the adverse effects of climate change in order to help them respond to loss and damage.
Wow, I definitely think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's great that we are recognizing this inequity and putting measures in place to address it. However, I think there is still lots to be done to truly make an impact.
Yeah, while this funding arrangement was one of the major takeaways from the conference, there are still a lot of unanswered questions and areas that still need to be considered.
That's fair. I guess that's where we come in. I think co design could be a really great way to develop solutions. If inclusive designers work with individuals who are facing this inequity, we will be able to ideate solutions that actually address the problem they are facing.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a great idea. These are voices that need to be heard because currently they're not, and that's why we have this mismatch with current sustainable designs that are aiming to address climate action in some way.
Mhm. And I think storytelling could be another way to do this. I'm sure there are many experiences and perspectives that we don't know about, and having these to be shared could be a powerful way to get these messages across and highlight the challenges they face.
Yeah, it sounds like we have a common theme of giving a voice to the individuals who are facing the most severe effects of climate change.
Yes, and I think that's where we as inclusive designers come in. We have the ability to work with these groups and potentially create solutions that are both sustainable and address their needs.
And if you're listening and wondering what you can do to make a difference, here are some things we can do or change in our everyday lives to reduce our carbon footprint. First, use fluorescent light instead of incandescent, which uses 40% less energy. Turn off devices when not in use, as sleep or standby mode still consumes energy. Reuse shopping bags and stay away from single use or non recyclable bags. And finally, buy fresh food instead of frozen food, since frozen food consumes 10 times more energy.
And if you are looking for more information on the topics of climate change and sustainable development, we have linked some helpful references and resources in the description section. Please check it out.
And that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and if nothing else, remember that we all have the power to make an impact.
We need innovation, and this kind of
I'm really
innovation.
glad people are starting to buy electric cars and
launched the largest tree plantation campaign.
It is now cheaper to build offshore wind farms.
To develop a climate-altering
by
crop.
continually reinvesting in our grassland, we are looking down on a critical moment that we cannot not be part of. Enormous opportunity in agriculture.
We can become stubborn optimists.
26 is one of the most important diplomatic gatherings in
But humanity already knows what to do.
Don't do it overnight, but we can set that end date.
We've got a long way to go.
But there is momentum.
Roll up your sleeves and do it.